In the last episode, we covered the dance of the alleles and microevolution. Microevolution being inherent in the name. Micro for small, being small-scale evolutionary changes. Examples of this are many, and we looked at a couple with peppered moths and bacterial resistance to antibiotics. With microevolution, we see changes within a species. But what about changes that bring about a new species? Back in episodes 104 and 105, we looked at speciation and some of its drivers. And in this episode, we'll move on from microevolution to macroevolution. Instead of changes of a small scale, macroevolution presents us with changes on a much larger and temporally longer scale.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
When we looked at microevolution, the example I used was the peppered moth. A mutation in the gene for lighter colored wings resulted in the allele for dark colored wings. As the environment changed, well, so did the population. That was a small change. The dark-winged peppered moth and light-winged peppered moth existed together and in the same place. This all occurred at the same time leading up to and during England's Industrial Revolution. So let's get fanciful for a moment. What if, long before any of this, a population of peppered moths, one segment, had been forced to split off? And you can pick how and why, but whatever the reason, the two populations of peppered moths were no longer in any contact. Whatever environmental pressures one group faced was different than what the other group had to endure. Let's say one group evolved to have larger wings. Not so much because of selective pressures, but because a mutation occurred that was neither advantageous or beneficial to that moth. The change persisted and remained in the gene pool. Another mutation gave the larger wings a somewhat pinkish hue, which, surprisingly, other moths were drawn to. Those moths with the pink-winged allele reproduced more often. Sexual selection stepped in. Over time, the population was full of large pink-winged moths. Meanwhile, that other population of peppered moths were going through their own changes. They'd grown smaller because the predators in the area preferred large moths. They were easier to find. This wasn't done consciously, of course. I mean, the transition from a larger to a smaller moth, the moths had no choice in the matter. A genetic mutation resulted in a smaller-sized moth, and that little moth was able to avoid being spotted by the predators. It had offspring, and they inherited the gene for smaller bodies. Other changes occurred that gave them larger eyes and antennas. Now, let's say many years later, an advantageous moth collector were to come along who, in his travels, happened to net a specimen from each population. One had large pink wings, and the other was much smaller with large eyes and large antennas. What would he jot down in his notebooks? Well, he'd describe two separate species of moths. And that's macroevolution. You may recall our episode on speciation. I mentioned it a few moments ago. The example I just gave could fall under allopatric speciation, given that the two populations of moths were separated geographically at one point in the distant past. Macroevolution isn't something we'd typically see happen around us. It takes time, a long time, but we do see the results. And we also see how it may have happened. For that, we have to dive into the fossil record. It's really a game of discovery. With enough fossils, we begin to see macroevolutionary patterns emerge. We can slowly piece together some of the transitions an animal's ancestors went through. We can begin to make predictions as well, even without the proper fossil to guide us. We'll find gaps, but with enough examples on either side of the gap, we can, with some assurance, predict what the organism that existed within that gap might have looked like. And we can also predict where we might find it. This is exactly what happened with the discovery of the transitional fossil known as Tiktaalik in 2004 on Ellesmere Island in Arctic Canada. That discovery was made by Professor Neil Shubin. Dating back 375 million years, Tiktaalik helped to fill the gap in our understanding of the water-to-land transition of early vertebrates. Tiktaalik displayed the acquisition of traits that enabled vertebrates to leave the ocean. Now, the amazing thing about its discovery was not that it was discovered at all, but that Professor Shubin was able to predict where he would find it and what it would look like. All because of the fossil record and some educated guesses that really would have made Sherlock Holmes proud.
It's often a mistake to accept something as true merely because it's obvious. The truth is only arrived at by the painstaking process of eliminating the untrue.
The fossil record is full of magnificent stories, and some of these stories read like generation-spanning sagas, like the epic story of the whale. Whales and their evolution from land-dwelling mammals to the aquatic giants of today really provide a compelling look at what macroevolution is capable of. It's a journey really like no other, and it's all there in the tale told by the fossil record. It starts 50 million years ago with Pakicetus, a small, somewhat wolf-sized animal that lived near the ocean. Living near the coast had its advantages, especially for finding food in the shallows, and Pakicetus apparently took advantage of it. A million years later, and we have Ambulocetus. It took a million years to go from Pakicetus to Ambulocetus, and here we find an otter-sized animal with strong hind limbs and long toes. It might have moved through the shallows by undulating its body like today's crocodiles do. 2 million years later, and we have an animal with a more streamlined body. Those hind limbs that were once large are now much smaller, and the front limbs resembled paddles in their structure. This is Rhodocetus, and it spent most of its time in the water and less time on land. Its nostrils had even moved a little further back on the skull to allow it to swim with its head ducked underwater while it hunted. A few million years after that, roughly 40 to 34 million years ago, we have Basilosaurus. With its long backbone and large, powerful tail flattened to allow for propulsion, Basilosaurus is clearly an example of a mammal that had left life on land behind it. It had returned to the sea, where its ancestors many million years before once lived. So, by exploring and piecing together the fossil record, we can trace their journey. It takes time, it takes study, and it takes maps. Not literal maps. These maps, the ones we attempt to follow, are hidden in stone. They're not easy to find, but when we begin to brush off the dust to reveal the lines and contours of what once was, it will inevitably lead us to today.
Archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. If it's truth you're interested in, Dr. Tyree's philosophy class is right down the hall. So forget any ideas you got about lost cities, exotic travel, and digging up the world. We do not follow maps to buried treasure, and X never, ever marks the spot. 70% of all archaeology is done in the library. Research, reading. We cannot afford to take mythology at face value.
Next week, Egyptology, starting with the excavation of New Crates by Flinders Petrie in 1885. I will be in my office if anybody's got any problems.
Well, with that bell, it sounds like Professor Jones is calling it a day. See you next time. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and if you find value in this show, please consider supporting it at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to keep the show alive and without ads, and I can only do so with your assistance. Help spread the word. Share the show with your friends. At evolutiontalk.com, you'll find more information, some recommended books, and ways to contact me. I'd love to hear from you. And I hope your week is going well, and until next time, Please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.